Hello. Hello, workers and friends. Welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist Leninist truck driver. I'm coming to you live from my humble home in rural North Carolina. And we're joined by my good friend, my good comrade, union organizer from Australia, Brother David Fox. How you doing, brother?
Very good, thank you.
Right on, right on. We have an all-star panel tonight, two experts in their fields. First time on, Nick from Flame of Liberation, who has done a lot of in-depth study, who has been one of the few people supporting heroic figures and putting up the legacy of Ba'athist Arab socialism. He was a guest on the Richard Medhurst show. He is also heavily involved with the Center for Political Innovation. Brother Nick of Flame of Liberation, how you doing?
Great to be with you. Yeah, I love your channel, Dust. You guys have a great panel, and it's really great to be on with you guys.
Right on. So, also we have another expert in his field, returning guest, I believe, doctoral candidate,
Yeah,
academic,
that's right.
as
PhD
well as
candidate.
um, a a political analyst and writer, brother Jay of the Oriental Despot. How you doing?
That's right. Thank you for having me.
Right on. So I might have confused people with some of the advertising for this show, and I just want to get right into it. I consider myself part of the emerging working class Marxist movement. Um, if you look at the Marxist movement in the West, it has been tied to the largely more academic, more middle class, more petty bourgeois counterculture movement. We really haven't had a mass working class movement, specifically in the United States, since the 1940s and 50s Communist Party. And one of the big things that the leader at Center for Political Innovation, Caleb Maupin, likes to talk about is the synthetic left. And one of the tendencies amongst the synthetic left is to be stuck in the protest cage. It's a tendency of Marxism, going back to Workers' World Party, which was the largest groups. We have splits off of that with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And essentially, they have become stage managers for the left movement, which means they are hopelessly hooked to liberals and liberalism. And they really are avoiding and not appealing to, writing off, and even demonizing rural workers specifically. It's largely the rural urban divide when you talk about Republicans and Democrats. And in this latest period, there has been mass outrage, just outrage against the raising in fuel prices, the inflation, and a number of issues. And we are seeing the synthetic left downplay these concerns, attack these concerns, telling people that the gas prices have nothing to do with Biden. There's places there's members like the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Bob Avakian cult. I remember seeing them out there. They were out in full force pushing for the impeachment against Trump, while Trump was being impeached for not giving guns or not giving aid to the Nazis in the Ukraine fast enough. They were organizing protests, and at their protest to get the so-called fascist Trump out the White House, they were actively supporting Russophobia. And they had, making fun of Putin, calling him, had images of dignitaries and foreign leaders, making them look like animals, dehumanizing the Russian people. And it was absolutely absurd and disgusting. So when I put out this image of I did that with Biden, it's true. I mean, even if you look at indirectly It has the fuel prices have a lot to do with speculation. But if we look at the overall economy, we are this is a monopoly capitalist imperialist economy. Both parties, the duopoly, is owned by these monopolies, and they are and this duopoly, this few group of bankers, this few group of oil companies, are the reason for all these wars, and they are the people who raise the prices. And Biden is their puppet. He can't even speak clearly. And I think we should be utilizing this outrage of rural workers, even if it's within the Trump movement, um, to try to say, "Oh, Biden's bad. You should vote for Trump." Well, if you looked at the more liberal synthetic left, I mean, they were rightfully um, organizing people with just grievances against Trump. I don't see why we shouldn't be organizing and uniting the masses of people, both rural and urban alike, against the monopolies and also against Biden and the Democrats. Let's see. Let's have brother Nick. Any response to some of those issues?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And how you describe that, that's exactly what I've been seeing. Here in New York, we see it's very condensed. The leftist groups, you see RCP, you see Workers World, PSL. You see these groups very easily. They're very open and active. And actually today, you probably saw I posted a picture from Center for Political Innovation in New York. We had a rally in support of Alex Saab, the Venezuelan diplomat who was kidnapped by the U.S. government. And at that rally, it was at Union Square in New York City. Right nearby, we saw this rally for abortion rights. It's totally separate group doing a rally for abortion rights. And there I see some people with Revolutionary Communist Party shirts. And so they're there rallying along with the Democrats for abortion rights, while we're here rallying against U.S. imperialism, against Venezuela. And of course, they don't come over to us or try and join us or anything. They have their separate thing and their focus on telling the Democrats whatever is, I'm not against, people having whatever right to choose or whatever, but it shows their priorities rather than opposing imperialism. They want to focus on tailing the Democrats. And you're absolutely right. We need to appeal to the working class of this country, not just, people think of it as just you have to appeal to the leftists and the liberals. Well, no, you have to appeal to the working class regardless of their politics. And some of these hacks, synthetic leftists and others, some supposed even Marxists who are have bought into, some supposed communists that have bought into the liberalism, the sort of Marxite liberal form of communism, quote unquote. They'll say that we pander to the right, quote unquote, pander to the right. Well, when Trump was elected, I went up to protest Trump. I went over to Washington, D.C. to protest Trump. And I had a sign, "Stop Trump's ultra-Zionist agenda," because at that point it was clear that he was an ultra-Zionist. And I went up with Workers World Party. So we're not in favor. We don't pander. Like, they want to make it seem as though we're like soft on Trump or something like that. We're not. We are equally opposed to the Democrats and the Republicans. The point is that the average working class person that's attracted to the Trump movement is not our enemy. In fact, those are the types of people we're supposed to be organizing, because Trump talked about standing up against the big banks, the corporations that outsourced all the jobs, all the endless wars. So we should be appealing to the people that message, that's our message. He's sort of hijacking our message. And these synthetic leftists want to act like it's quote unquote anti-Semitic to talk about the banks. I mean, that's just completely insane. So this is our, that's our, populism, leftist populism. That is our message. And if Trump is using that, well, we have to do our best to try and counter that and win over these working class people that could sort of get hijacked by this. And what the synthetic leftists do by attacking all these working class people who might be socially conservative or whatever, they're actually strengthening the right. because they're actually saying that those ideas, those anti-establishment ideas, are right-wing. They're not left-wing, and we leftists are coming here to beat you guys up and stuff. It's the exact opposite of what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to say that the left these ideas are actually what the left promotes, and we're on the same side as everyone in the working class, and our struggle is against both parties.
Thank you, comrade. Let's see, comrade Jay. What are your thoughts on these issues?
Well, just to pick up on what you were saying about Trump, I mean, part of the reason I believe that Trump was elected is because of waning US dollar hegemony. And a lot of people in the United States, particularly in the so-called flyover states, the parts of the United States that have been economically neglected, the parts of the United States that have deindustrialized over the past 30 years, they saw in Trump somebody who would bring industries and jobs back to the United States. And whether they do it consciously or not, or whatever their reasons are for voting for Trump, is not really relevant. I think as Marxists, you should look at the underlying conditions that compel them to go out and vote for Trump. And it comes down to the deindustrialization of the United States. Ever since the 1980s, Trump has been talking about how other countries have been getting a free ride because America's markets have been open to their goods. In the past, he used to rail against Japan, and then in the lead up to the 2016 elections, he was focusing mainly on China. And the problem here is that there's a contradiction that comes with the US dollar being the world reserve currency. The US dollar has a particular exorbitant privilege, which is a term that I'm borrowing from the former French prime minister, President de Gaulle. And this exorbitant privilege is that the United States is the only country in the world that can run up gigantic debts and deficits that no other country in the world can. So the US is currently has like a net the net investment position, net international investment position of the United States is negative $14 trillion. And that means that's like the level of debt, so that's like the US is a net debtor to that amount. And no other country can do this. But like the flip side of this is that although the United States can essentially print its imports, although the United States can print money and then just import goods from the rest of the world, these goods then compete with US industry. But it was US industry that made the US dollar worth holding in the first place. So it's a catch-22 type of cycle. And so that's why you see people like Trump emerging. So there is an element of truth, and it's important for I think Marxists to identify the element of truth in what like Trump was saying and why workers voted for him. Now, of course, once Trump came to power, he wasn't able to deliver on the reasons why the people who voted for him voted for him, and that's largely because he's compromised by other interests. He ended up bombing Syria because he's acting, he's got he's got the Israel lobby behind him. But like that issue of US currency hegemony, hasn't been resolved. I mean, let's like look at it in terms of capital flight from the third world. From 1980 to 2016, capital flight from the developing world amounted to about $16 trillion, which is about the same amount of money that the US is currently in debt to with the rest of the world. And the largest share of that was actually from China at $4.6 trillion. And of that share, I mean, like, so if you look at it, like, a large percentage of like a major reason for why the US dollar has been upheld over the years is because of capital flight from the third world. So what happens is that the US, they encourage countries around the world to have neoliberal policies, which means that they have to lift restrictions on capital controls, lift restrictions on trade. And this then means that the elites in these countries, they start taking their money out of the country and they start, sending it to the US banking system. And this has been a major reason for why the US dollar has been propped up over the years. Plus, also the fact that all of the commodities exchanges in the world are denominated in US dollars. And so if you're a country anywhere in the world, and let's say, India wants to do business with Saudi Arabia, traditionally, India would pay for oil, which is the typical import from Saudi Arabia, in US dollars, even though US goods are not being exchanged. So that entire system is being undermined because of the economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, which are now backfiring. And the thing is, the people that are talking about this, that are being affected the most by this, are actually in Europe. So German trade unions recently came out and they said that German industries such as steel, chemicals, and paper would shut down within a matter of weeks if the country decided to cut off imports of energy from Russia, which is their largest source of energy. And that's there's been the Michael Vassiliadis. He's the president of Germany's Chemical Workers Union. I mean, he's been talking about this as well. And so, yeah, I mean, Germany has to face the anger of its own working class because this is going to put something like, the estimate is that it's going to put about 3.4 million employees in the German construction industry at risk of losing their jobs because, everything runs on energy, so halting Russian gas, oil, and coal imports is going to undermine those jobs. And this is because, Germany would much rather play along with the American strategy against Russia than serve its own interests, which is actually very ironic if you look at it from a historical point of view, because historically, the NATO really inherits the geopolitical, the geostrategic orientation of the fascist axis. If you look at a map of NATO, it's very similar to the map of NATO of Nazi-occupied Europe. And from a Russian point of view, the Nazi invasion was essentially a Western invasion. But today, if you look at what's happening, Germany and Russia actually want to do business with each other. It's the United States that needs the conflict in Ukraine to keep going in order to undermine the process of Eurasian integration, to undermine Germany and Russia doing business with each other. And this goes back to the geostrategy promoted by what's his name, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who died a few years ago, and he wrote this book called The Grand Chessboard. And in that book, he talks about this. He says we have to prevent Europe and Russia from just doing normal business with each other and having friendly relations with each other. So there's been a lot of pressure there. I mean, the Polish prime minister as well, because Poland, like a lot of the arms that are coming into Ukraine to support the Kiev regime against Russia are coming via Poland. The Polish prime minister very clearly said, the sanctions we have imposed so far don't work. The best evidence is the ruble exchange rate. And just looking at that exchange rate, I mean, people, I was actually expecting the ruble to plunge, and just keep plunging. And it did plunge, midway into March, it plunged to about 150 rubles to the dollar. But actually, it's fully recovered now. Yep. And the reason it's fully recovered is because Russia is now imposing severe restrictions on capital flight. You can't take more than $10,000 out of the country now. They've raised interest rates to 20%. They've banned short selling. Short selling is when you're betting on the price of something falling and then you can make lots of money. They've banned that, and so they've imposed these really, really harsh restrictions. But the other factor is that the third world is willing to continue doing business with Russia. So that's the other thing I wanted to talk about. I mean, India is going to resume trade in rupees. So India is going to be able to import goods from Russia by paying in rupees and vice versa. So that's like a major problem for the US. And so what I've noticed that was interesting is that the US is now the US government is now promoting Indian Americans. So the latest one is this guy called Dalip Singh. And he's been promoted to lecture India on why it should intentionally squeeze its own population's incomes with inflation just so the US can punish Russia. So that's what the US is resorting to. And the thing is, he himself said, he said that by India propping up the ruble in this way was undermining the dollar-based financial system, which is absolutely correct. But India is just serving its own interests. But none of this had to happen. I mean, it reminds me of that crazed liberal who stood outside a petrol station and he started blaming Vladimir Putin for the petrol prices going up, even though it was the sanctions on Russia that caused that to happen. So people are completely confused. And there's also a threat to the SWIFT banking system because countries around the world are coming up with their own interfaces and their own payment systems. India has the Unified Payments Interface. That's what it calls it. Russia has the MIR payment system. And again, this represents the diversification away from the American banking system. So none of this had to happen. This is entirely a cost that the Western working class has to pay because of this ongoing strategy of trying to aggressively contain Russia through NATO expansion.
I apologize, everyone. I had my internet connection removed through technical difficulties. I am back. I'm not sure how far the conversation progressed. David, were you able to respond to Jay since I've been gone?
Well, that's actually in fact there's two things. I've just been analysing things for the last probably just what the whole thing what you call left for the last 20 years. And I remember someone said on the CPI conference in Austin, they said in the 1990s it was rage against the machine, and now all of a sudden everything's all these little one-off issues and it's nothing's class focused. And I sort of remember that, and I thought, back in year 2000, I was involved in a massive blockade of the World Economic Forum in Melbourne at the time. And there were thousands of people, tens and thousands of people. We had the whole place blocked up outside the Crown Casino. It was a great time as well. But it was all, I realised, it was a response against the whole neoliberal policies, free trade agreement. Everyone was sort of like focused, basically broaden the base, we narrowed the target. And I think after, say, the Iraq War, the peace movement, and everything else, it sort of split off, and now it's all these sub factions and out and out. And then I thought, well, how did we come from that state of affairs to where we are now? And I had to look at the economic conditions at the time also too. You mentioned the deindustrialisation of the US. In Australia, we've deindustrialised big time. Unions have been in decline. We've lost a lot of industry. Actually, obviously, COVID exposed Australia in how import dependent we are now on basically anything. We, very manufacture very little. Most companies offshored everything, and now they realise that they'd have to come back in house. But even just obtaining the raw materials is a huge task. So I guess when I was hearing people talking, I thought, well, this is going on to what the second point, what's primary, what's going on with the world economy at the time. And yeah, it's interesting. They want to blame one single person or one government for the whole problem, but it's actually the whole thing of the whole systematic, what we call imperialism, the global globalisation, the whole lot tied to the US dollar. And I'm just thinking how it's going to affect us here in Australia as well, because our currency is locked in step with the US dollar. And basically, our whole economy is pretty much entwined in it as well, and our foreign policy. Well, that's what we call a business plan, a foreign business plan. It's actually not independent at all. It's basically, AKA U.S. State Department foreign policy. So we're all caught up with that, and what's going to affect here. And further on, we're having a look at whatever movements are out there, but when it comes to a crunch, when Australia's pushed over the edge, the economy kind of collapses, and obviously if the US goes down, we will be too. This whole idea we were insular from, and secure from the old global financial crisis to all these other things. We're not. We're going to be subject to a lot of eruptions and that. And so, the question I would have for a lot of people out there, what are you going to do when people are going to go hungry? Because once those people have got empty stomachs, then you've got a problem on your hand. And and I know fact is, years ago, it's not. We can all blame the major parties, Labor and Liberal here, and it's more of the same attitudes they had. But look, what the fact is, at the end of the day, none of them are going to be able to come up with solutions with anything on the way forward. So we're sort of caught in this, and obviously with all the propaganda that's been blasted out here in this country, it's been phenomenal. I've stopped watching mainstream media for well over a month, for very obvious reasons. It really does my head in and does anyone else's head in when you watch it. I just can't believe the actual lying they do. And I thought some people I thought would know better, but obviously didn't, and gone down the same path. So they've, and I think what we're looking at here, all this propaganda about what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, what's going on with all the rest of the economy. They're basically trying to cover up the actual root cause of the problem itself, and that is the imperialist economic basis. It's on the verge of collapse, and they know that, and they actually want to keep us divided one way or the other. Because it was interesting when you're talking about trying to approach those workers who supported Trump. I know why they did. Back in 2016, actually, I was at a union meeting on a project up in the Pilbara, and everyone was on there, showed me the phones. Oh, look at the results, and they were cheering it on. Interesting enough, even in Australia. And I actually did an analysis for him. I just said to him, look, there's strictly a reason why they would do something, because he touched the key primary fundamental question for us, the economic question, job security, bringing back industries and all that, and quality of living and a whole lot. He did that. You didn't get that from the Democrats. And they're going to avoid it. So he did that, and all of a sudden that clicked on someone's switch. Oh, he's speaking for us now. Wow, he's going to be pushing our agenda. So, and look, let's face it. Too, after Trump was elected, he actually had a meeting with union leaders over in the US, talking about they were keen to bring back manufacturing. I think he wanted, I'm not too sure if he wanted a working relationship there, but he was certainly this is what he wanted to do, and they endorsed it. So, I don't know, we're living in some times, but I can understand, we live in some interesting times. I can understand what's going on here is the economic question, what's primary and what's been reflected from there. And it was a good analysis by both you, Nick and Jay did themselves. And I think it's something we've always got to keep in mind. We've got to be keeping focus on what's primary. I can blame certain groups, we can do this and that, but I mean, we've got to keep the focus on what's going on the ground here.
So we haven't really had a commentary on the situation in Ukraine since it broke out. Last week we were very glad to be joined by Sister Delia Gray and Comrade Anderson to continue our. We started a study on demands. Which is a very important part of the revolutionary process. It's not about tailing the Democrats or Republicans. It's about making concrete demands, concrete economic demands that this system cannot make, that the current political infrastructure cannot make. Getting people, mobilizing the people to push for those demands and build working class power. And we're getting into that study on our demands. Keep looking for that. Next week, we're going to be studying Emiliano Zapata's Plan de Ayala. A lot of people don't put enough emphasis, I believe, because of Eurocentrism. They do not put enough emphasis on the Mexican Revolution, which took part only 7 years prior. So be looking for that next week. But let's get into this Ukraine deal. So I'm going to break it down from a truck driver, from a worker who's in a rural area, and I keep my eyes on imperialism. I've been following Texas and Donbass basically since he got there. And this dude is somebody I completely relate with, and just his passion and his fervor for humanity and to fight for justice, to fight for truth. And man, and the way I've seen it, this is almost like the Spanish Civil War in a lot of ways. You had people around the world, people who believed in justice and truth and anti-fascism on one side, protecting the people of Donbass, and you've had Nazis from all over the world come and join on the other side. So I mean, I had this background already in knowing, that, and I knew about the coup in 2014. I know that even though Ukraine is not technically a part of NATO, They have been a NATO military base since 2014 with an entrenched NATO state that's infested with Nazis and has been carrying out horrific acts against minority populations. They're not a functioning democracy at all. It's absolutely disgusting. We know this. But let's bring it down to the regular worker on the street. What do they see? Well, this goes a lot to do with the level of propaganda, the level of lies, the level of just stuff going everywhere. I mean, I saw a fellow trucker with a Ukrainian flag taped up on their door. More of like a alternative. You don't hear a lot of hippie truckers, but there are a few. And this was one of them. But he was obviously manipulated by the propaganda machine. And I went on Sister Dahlia's show, and I talked with average people, and I tried to get the correct analysis out there from an anti-imperialist perspective, which is the truth, basically. and all we see is this massive amount of propaganda. Putin is evil. Putin invaded a small country. The short, simple version from Kamala Harris. You see, Russia's a big country, and they got this small country, Ukraine, and they decide to go in there and invade them, and that's wrong. And that can't be any further for the truth. So first we get this massive propaganda. And then a week or two later, the gas prices shoot up $1. They went from about $3 to $4, I think even up as high as $4.20. And that's immediately putting a hit on working people's pocketbooks. So you got the right wing that's just like, oh, Obama, Biden ain't handling it. It's interesting. The Trump milieu, some of the more hardcore conservatives are split on this issue. A lot of them have been taking the mainstream Republican narrative. But other ones, the more so-called Alex Jones, conspiratorial, the people who are, considered right-wing libertarians, there's actually a lot of them who have been, not trusting the corporate media. And if you point out, George Soros is one of they're one of their pawns they like to use because there's a lot of anti-Semitism. But I mean, George Soros is a horrible billionaire hooked in with the imperialists and the globalists as well. So there's kind of a split amongst Trump's, the conservative movement, those who don't believe the mainstream media and those that have. And I think the majority of them have believed the right way. And their position is, oh, Biden is old and he's not anti-Russia enough, which is really dangerous. And then you got this stuff from the liberal point of view is absolutely classist and sickening. This stuff like, why didn't you had Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, get out from the state, say, hey, all you workers need to shut up about these fuel prices. Why don't you buy an electric car? You rednecks are killing the environment. Why do you got these big trucks? You need to shut that down and buy these $50,000 electric cars that none of us can afford. I paid less than $10,000 for my truck out there. I mean, I couldn't afford a $50,000 car anytime, with the money I'm making. It's absolutely absurd. So you got these elitist, classist people telling people to shut up.
Colbert.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. Telling people to shut up about the fuel prices, and people are rightfully angry, especially in the liberals. And then you got like more working class people that are in with the liberals are like, man, I really can't afford this stuff, but I really hate Putin, and it's a shame the way they're manipulating and twisting people, and it's absolutely disgusting. I want to go to Brother Nick of a Flame of Liberation. And what I got to say, what I got to ask you, if you could talk to people on the street, people that don't have our anti-imperialist understanding and background, regardless of their leaving, whether they're apolitical, whether they're conservative, whether they're liberal, if you had to break down this situation of, the larger imperialist system and the events in Ukraine, and tell them straight up what the truth was in a short amount of time, how would you do it?
Yeah, what I would say, and what I do say, I talk to people on the street and people around. When I do talk to people, just random people around about this situation, what I say is, you know, they always tell us that they don't have money for health care, they don't have money for education, they don't have money for housing, they can't provide jobs to the public. This is all left up to the quote unquote free market. Those roads that you drive on every day that are falling apart, that they can't fix, that are always messed up, that are fucking up your car that you drive on, or if you take mass transit, it's always late. It's always getting worse. The subway system, the bus systems, the mass transit system, it's always getting worse, always falling apart more, always getting worse and worse, but the price is always going up. They tell us we don't have money for any of this stuff that is actually relevant to you as someone living in this country. But look at what just happened in Ukraine, halfway across the world. Something that is not related to it doesn't border the United States. It's not an immediate issue for the United States. Immediately, at the snap of the finger, they're authorizing massive amounts of military weaponry to go into Ukraine. Not to mention, for the past 8 years, the Obama administration, Trump administration, and Biden administration have been flooding Ukraine with weapons. So they have money for all of that, but they don't have money for things that'll actually improve your life and the things that you struggle with every single day. That's number one. And then number two, just getting into the history, the media lies. We know this. And the good thing is now more and more people are waking up to the fact that the media is lying. We have a list of all the things they lied about. We weren't born yesterday. We saw Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. You remember just less than a year ago, Kabul's not going to fall, right? Then we saw this insane spectacle of this extremely horrible. I mean, the U.S. needed to get out. The U.S. should have never gone in, but the way it was done was absolutely disastrous for the Afghan people. So the United States, the media lies all the time. And in fact, it's lied more than it's told the truth. In fact, when you see something in the media, you have to assume it's a lie because on all the foreign policy issues, they've lied. And anytime they might tell you something that's factually true, it's only for the purpose of misleading you in another way. And and on the other hand is all of these lists of countries that the United States has destroyed over the years. And we look at how the United States treated Afghanistan just, in the past year, what happened with the U.S. pullout. That was, again, the U.S. needed to pull out, but the U.S. did it in like the most disastrous way possible. The United States has no moral high ground whatsoever to be complaining about another country taking care of an issue on its border. Why is that our business, even besides getting into the specifics of Ukraine, which we'll get into? Why is it the United States' business? Ukraine borders Russia. Ukraine does not border the United States. Therefore, Russia has an interest in taking care of business in that country. They have a border there. There's a war that's been going on there for 8 years. They have an interest in resolving the situation there. The United States has no interest there. It's none of our business. And while our country's falling apart, our politicians, our media, they want to tell us that we have to, all these Ukrainian flags everywhere. Well, they don't seem to give a damn about the working class of this country that's suffering terribly. And when working class people actually do stand up, like the trucker protest, the media and all these hacks want to denounce them and attack them and destroy them and support the Canadian government's crackdown on them. It just shows the complete hypocrisy. And whatever the media is telling us, we have to realize that this is not in our interest. The media is controlled by the billionaires who have the complete opposite interests of what we have. And that's why they say all this stuff. That's why they want to spread all this propaganda to try and indoctrinate everybody to cry for Ukraine, but never give a damn about the Palestinian people, never give a damn about the Iraqi people, Syrian people, Libyan people. And all the more hypocritical, they never gave a damn about the people of Donbass, which is in the border of Ukraine. For the past 8 years, where they're talking about Ukraine for the past 8 years, people that they're not really Ukrainians, they're Russians, but to these establishment hacks, they would consider them Ukrainian. They say that this is part of Ukraine. Why don't they care about those Ukrainians in the Donbass? They speak Russian. They never gave a damn about them for 8 years. They've been being killed. So this is all complete nonsense. And right now, the media propaganda is really strong. But just like with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, just like with Gaddafi, and there's no Al Qaeda in Libya, and this is all peaceful protests, and it's all going to lead to democracy. Just like all these cases, we anti-imperialists will be proven right. And when the damage is done already, all of these media hacks will say, "Oh, we got this one wrong. Whoops, we messed up on this one. We got this wrong." And we're already starting to see information coming out of lies from the media. In fact, I did a couple videos on some of the fully documented lies about Ukraine that are just not even up for debate. They're just complete lies that have been spread by the media. So anything the media says, especially on foreign policy, you have to not listen to it.
Can I just add something? So, the oil prices going up, obviously it's affecting the working class in the United States and across the West. And there's a very simple reason for this. It's because, Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular have had a modus vivendi. They've been collaborating on oil prices for a very long time. And that's because they're just serving their own interests. And in the current situation, Saudi Arabia needs oil prices to be high so they can pay for their war against Yemen, which is a genocide. 377,000 people dead, 70% of whom were children under the age of 5. And so the biggest killer is actually the blockade, not even the bombs. So both of these countries, they need high oil prices. So this is a situation in which I would say to people who hate Russia, who are opposed to the Russian invasion, I'd say, look, if you want oil prices to fall, and if on top of that you want to punish Russia, well, one easy way you can do that is by demanding that Saudi Arabia stops the war on Yemen. Why is that not a course of action? Like, I don't want to punish Russia. That's not my interest. I mean, I care about the Yemeni people. Because, if Saudi Arabia stops the war on Yemen, then they can actually afford to produce more oil. Because up until now, they've been saying no. Biden has been telling Saudi Arabia and telling the UAE to increase production of oil. And these countries have basically said no because they are cooperating with Russia to keep oil prices high. And so the question then is, well, why not just stop the war on Yemen? Because then these countries could actually afford to drop oil prices.
Yeah.
Right on, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think actually too, on back, it's really basically coming down to the sense where the falling rate of profits everywhere. So basically, what we're seeing here, multinational.
Dave, bring your mic closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, just.
I was just saying we're in the era of the falling rate of profit, and the fact is, what the massive energy companies such as the Shells of the world, BP, etc., are using this as an excuse to generate more profit for themselves. Money we won't be seeing it be into, and you look at it, and it's not just weapons manufacturers, it's not just energy, it's anything else, but also the complete monopolisation of any existing markets altogether now. So pushing any what they deem as any competition away from raw materials, raw commodities, and agricultural products right through to secondary manufacturing type products, etc. So that's what they're trying to do. But what, in fact, they're doing at the same time, trying to prop up a profit while everything else is collapsing. So one has to give but virtually everything's falling down on them. So they're trying to switch every time to prop something up while the other part collapses. And I like an old term someone said to me once. It's a capitalist solution to a capitalist problem. They can't deal with this anymore, and you can see that the system's on the verge of collapse. I also too just wanted to clear up any confusion, because I know we use different type of measurement systems, and obviously in the chats there I just put before, 1 US gallon is 3.8 litres here in Australia. We pay by the litre in fuel. yesterday it was roughly around about $1.89 for just basic unleaded fuel. You times that by 3.8, that works out to be $7.182 US dollar or Australian dollars. And I don't know what that would be in US. It'd probably be about 6 or something like that, roughly, for a gallon. So that's how we calculate it. But what I'm saying is, what we're seeing is they're trying to prop up one while the other collapses, and then they'll address this while this one collapses. The federal government just recently released their budget for the year, and they've reduced the fuel excise by, I think it was 20 cents a litre, and it's only going to last for 6 months. But what happens? Nothing's ever addressed about the profit motive. They're talking about governments moving in. Why can't they actually put price controls in there? Suddenly saying, you're not going to make massive profits out of this anymore. The other thing as well, the whole profit motive, it's what they're trying to, it's nothing being addressed. They want to talk about workers' wages being either low or too high. They want to work and talk about everything else, but no one talking about what the other big problem is, the profit motive. Okay, why can't the big multinationals reduce their profit motive? At least by 50%. Imagine that. But they won't do it, obviously. The other one I was just going to mention as well. I mean, it's so odd if they reduce their fuel excise by 20 cents. They'll just find an excuse to make more profit out of that as well and beef it up again. So this is what we're seeing is the declining rate of profit everywhere. And who's going to suffer? All of us working class people. Suffer from it because we're now paying for much higher prices on everything, not just for fuel, but for food. And I believe there's now food shortages there in Europe by the looks of the supermarket shelves. So that's another big problem. And food security is going to be an interesting discussion to have in the future. And other various manufacturing goods that people need to meet their daily needs. So you can see this is going to have a whole chain reaction right through. And as I said, for us here in Australia, we're not immune from this. Like I said from the start, when you look at Australia, we're such an import-dependent country. I mean, 8% of any industry, in manufacturing only makes 8% of the whole entire workforce. Where in the 70s it was 35, I think it was mid-60s when it was highest, around about 40-45%. So the domestic economy is shot to pieces. And so you can see this overflow effect. But reality is, at the end of the day, I think the question for us is how we're going to need to direct people's anger towards the actual primary problem here, not just believing what the media says to us.
Very good. Nick, you mentioned earlier we could about going into the details on what's going on Ukraine. And I believe that us within the Center for Political Innovation, the tanky, the pro-Russian left, we are a unique position. PSL isn't putting out this position. They've gone pretty weak on this. They're comparing this to World War I, as if this is an inter-imperialist rivalry. So, from somebody who respects, the movements of oppressed nations like the Ba'athist Arab socialist movement, as well as Gaddafi and Libya, maybe you could just break down a quick point by point of what happened in Ukraine and what is the situation there.
Well, this whole situation was, as all of us on this panel, I'm sure already agree, completely manufactured by the West. You could take it back to 2013, 2014, and you could take it back even further than that. But to start for right now, let's say 2013, 2014, there was a democratically elected government in Ukraine that was, the Western media now likes to call it pro-Russia, quote unquote. Well, I guess compared to this,
we lost you for a second. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, they try to say that it's this that it was this pro-Russian government. But I guess compared to this insanely anti-Russian government that exists, you could call it quote unquote pro-Russia. But it wasn't pro-Russia. It was a pragmatic government that wanted to be in the middle between Russia and the West. They were not particularly on either side. Now, they respected the Russian-speaking people of the country. That's true, and that's good. That's not a bad thing. I don't understand how anyone could say that that's a bad thing. But as far as relations with Russia and the West, they wanted to have a middle ground and get as best of a deal as they could by playing both sides. And to the Western imperialists, to the U.S. government, we have to think back to that statement from George Bush around the start of the so-called war on terror. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. According to the imperialists, there is no middle ground. That's why you see they're so angry at India right now. India doesn't want to. India has a long history of non-alignment and a long history of friendship with Russia. And they don't want to, they want to have a middle ground position. And the United States is furious at India because of that. And that was the situation with Ukraine. They could not tolerate Ukraine being an independent country that was wanting to have good relations with both the West and Russia. And so there was this deal with the EU that Ukraine was considering joining the EU, and the leader of Ukraine, Yanukovych, he realized that if he signed this deal, it was an extreme neoliberal austerity deal that would have ruined the living standards of the Ukrainian people, especially the elderly people in Ukraine, would have cut their pensions, all this. It was a neoliberal austerity measure. And he realized, not even necessarily out of, any sort of moral position, so to speak, but just out of practically, if he signed this deal, it would destroy him politically. So he realized he could not do this. It was bad for the country, bad for the working people of Ukraine. So he rejected it. And so the West went all in to try and topple him. And initially there were, as with all these color revolutions that we see around the world, initially there were legitimate grievances against the Ukrainian government in 2013. This is a capitalist government. This is not a socialist government. This is post-Soviet Union. So there were legitimate grievances. But the protesters were never calling for, the initial peaceful protesters were never calling for joining NATO. That was never, they never wanted to join NATO. That was not what they were calling for. They were against corruption and such. But then the United States, of course, as always with these color revolutions, went in with a heavy funding, and U.S. operatives using these far-right neo-Nazis, right sector, Svoboda Party, and other ultra-nationalist Ukrainian Nazis who carry the portraits of Stepan Bandera and the flags of the Ukrainian insurgent army. These people collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and did ethnic cleansing of massive pogroms against Jews, against Poles, against Russians, against other ethnicities. These were Nazi collaborators. There's no question about it. Stepan Bandera, he worked hand in hand with the Nazis. He carried out ethnic cleansing of the Jewish population and other populations in Ukraine. Horrible atrocities. And these people, the United States backed them because they were a strong fighting force. They were sort of like militias and gangs. And so the United States mobilized these fascist forces to come into the peaceful protests and to attack the police, the Ukrainian police, and then fall back into the peaceful protests and sort of act as provocateurs to get the police to attack peaceful protesters, to add fuel to the fire. And so this got accelerated and accelerated. It seemed like there was an off-ramp from this at a certain point, and it went into 2014. This is late 2013 when this is starting. Then in 2014, it started to accelerate more. You had incidents of these suspicious snipers sniping at both sides, both sniping at the protesters and the police. Something like that, it's completely obvious. This is not the government doing this. This is a force trying to destabilize, firing at both the police and the protesters. A state that's trying to remain in power and defuse a situation like this is never going to do something like that. Or I shouldn't say never, but it's just completely counterintuitive. It's the last thing that they would want to do. And firing on their own people and the protesters to basically get more hostility, anger against the government. This is pretty obviously some form of foreign intelligence doing this for the purpose of further destabilizing the Ukrainian government. And this got accelerated and accelerated, and it culminated in a coup against Ukraine's democratically elected government. And this was heavily funded. It's recorded, the funding is all recorded from the U.S. Embassy and everything. It's there's no way of trying to deny it. McCain and all these politicians went over to Ukraine, cheered on the crowds, gave speeches and supported these crowds, telling them to overthrow the Ukrainian government. This was absolutely a U.S. operation. And while there were legitimate grievances and people who did peacefully protest in the beginning, this was hijacked and taken to something new. And this is what we saw in countless countries around the world. Syria, there were some legitimate grievances with the Syrian government, but they were completely blown out of proportion and turned into a completely destructive imperialist regime change operation. This is what they do. They try and first play on where there's legitimate grievances, and these people are not calling for being Western puppets. They don't want NATO and all this stuff. They don't want to overthrow their government, but the United States and its allies come in and ramp up the situation and throw as much fuel on the fire as they can to try and topple the government. And so that's what happened in Ukraine. And again, at the forefront of it were these Ukrainian ultranationalist neo-Nazis who glorify Stepan Bandera. And half of the country, here's the thing, Ukraine is really not one country. It's really an artificial country. It's not some historical entity that's existed for such a long period of time. Ukraine, half of the country at least, identifies with Russia. They speak Russian. They identify with Russia. They've always considered themselves to be Russians. And so that half of the country wanted nothing to do with these ultra-nationalist Nazi supporters. And so in Crimea, they had a referendum. The Western media, the imperialist politicians who, by the way, invade all over. They've never seen an invasion that they don't like from their own side. But they started saying that Russia invaded Crimea. It's a complete lie. The people of Crimea, majority of whom are Russians, voted in a referendum to rejoin with Russia, because let's remember, Crimea is Russian territory. It was given to Ukraine by the Soviet leader at the time, Nikita Khrushchev. It was always part of Russia, but in the 1950s, Khrushchev gave it away to the Ukrainian Republic. At the time, it didn't matter that much because Soviet Union, Ukrainian Soviet Republic, Russian Soviet Republic, it's still within the country, so it didn't matter that much. But it's a Russian territory. It's historically been part of Russia. There's a very important Russian naval base there, and that naval base goes back for a very long period of time, even before the Soviet Union. So it's Russian territory. And with this illegal coup against Ukraine's democratically elected government and the rise of these anti-Russian ultra-nationalists who wanted to kill all Russian speakers, kill all of the Jewish population, kill all the Poles, and just completely get rid of anyone who doesn't speak Ukrainian. These people in Crimea wanted nothing to do with that. This is completely illegal, unconstitutional. And so they took it upon themselves to get out of that situation. And they voted democratically to leave and rejoin with Russia. And those are the facts on that. And then you had a similar phenomenon in the Donbas region of Ukraine, which is in the east of the country. Again, vast majority of whom are Russians. They had peaceful protests against this. They tried to hold referendums to have a similar situation where they wanted to declare their independence. And the Ukrainian fascist coup regime sent in the tanks to run over old people who were protesting in the streets. And so the people of the Donbass took up arms. And this is in 2014, following the coup. And they kicked the Ukrainian government's ass, to be completely clear. There's no two ways about it. And the Ukrainian fascist regime was forced to negotiate with the people of Donbass and form the Minsk Accords. And since then,
he's cut out.
Since then, oh, can you hear me?
Go
Since
ahead.
then, the Ukrainian government was never serious about these Minsk Accords.
I think everyone just cut out there for a sec. Nick, you cut out for a bit.
The
Go ahead. Jay, I think refresh your window. I think it's on your end. Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. No, my window's fine.
Yeah, so the Minsk Accords, there was Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 because the Ukrainian government was never serious about it. And the Ukrainian government has been bombing Donbass on and off heavily. When we're talking about bombing, these are Donetsk and Lugansk. These are cities, where, like a city. You know, this is where civilians live, and they're bombing with heavy artillery, with drones, all this stuff. This kills a lot of people. This destroys buildings. And this led to huge numbers of deaths. I think it was in the past couple of years. I think it was the past 3 years, or maybe it was longer since they started counting this. But there's this statistic that 14,000 people in the Donbass have been killed. You know, where's the outrage over that? That's the Ukrainian government killing those people with full NATO backing. This has been going on for 8 years. And, you know, there was Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. And the Ukrainian government is never serious about this. And this situation was going on and off for the past 8 years. Then things came to a head in, in February, or a little bit before that. You could say last year, Zelensky, he was trying to act tough. And he was talking about how he's going to retake the Donbass. He's going to retake, quote unquote, Crimea. And he started talking about acquiring nuclear weapons. And you have all these biolabs backed by the U.S. in Ukraine, these bioweapons labs aimed at Russia. Let's be very clear about that. And it's basically confirmed at this point by the U.S. government, and there's a record of the funding. This is not some crazy conspiracy theory. Even Victoria Nuland basically admitted it without saying it outright. She basically admitted it, and so. This has been going on, and shortly before Russia's quote-unquote invasion, the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, the Ukrainian government was preparing a full-on onslaught against the people of the Donbass, and they actually initiated it. They started heavily bombing the Donbass. They tried to do a full ground invasion. They attempted breakthroughs of the defenders of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic defenders. And so at that point, Russia saw what was going on. This was an all-out attempt by the Ukrainian regime to invade the Donbass and massacre the people of the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass. And let's remember, along with not only the Ukrainian standard military, but the Azov Battalion, which was officially a wing of the Ukrainian National Guard, not some fringe group that they try to say. It was a wing of the Ukrainian National Guard, and they are Nazis. There's no question about it. They're open about it. Some people try to say, well, they might not all be Nazis. They're not blah, 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 this bullshit. Their symbol, their official symbol has the wolf's angle, which is a clear reference to what was used by the SS divisions. And then there's also the black sun, which was a Nazi symbol. These are in their official emblem. They often use standard old swastika flags. They carry the portraits of Stepan Bandera. This wing of the Ukrainian military, which calls for ethnic cleansing, getting rid of all Russian-speaking people, they were going to go in with the Ukrainian military and commit a genocide against the Russian-speaking people of Donbass. That's what they had in their plans. And to be absolutely clear, this wasn't even necessarily the Ukrainian government pushing for this. This was the United States pushing the Ukrainian government to do this. To be very clear, this was the United States trying to do this. This wasn't even in the Ukrainian government on their own. It wasn't even in their interest for their survival, because look what's happening now. They're getting their asses kicked. They should have known this is going to be a red line for Russia to intervene. And that just shows you that this was the United States that pushed the Ukrainian government to do this, because the Ukrainian government is a puppet of the United States. And so with Ukraine attempting to do this invasion and bombing of the Donbass again, it forced like 80,000 refugees from Donbass to flee to Russia. Russia had to take in a massive amount of refugees. And at that point, Vladimir Putin gave his speech recognizing, finally, after 8 years, recognizing the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. All these hacks want to say, oh, you can't invent countries, blah, blah, blah. You know, you can't invent countries. Well, he did not invent them. He absolutely did not invent them. These were around for 8 years. He did not recognize them for 8 years. So how anyone could try to say that he invented them? It was the people of the Donbass who took up arms in self-determination, in an anti-fascist struggle, and the struggle for survival against these fascist, neo-Nazi, ultra-nationalists who want to ethnically cleanse the Russian speakers. They're the ones who declared their independence from Ukraine. It wasn't Russia that did this. It was the people of the Donbass on their own. And Russia actually did not want to recognize them, but finally did After 8 years of this nonsense and mass killing of the people, they finally did. And then Russia declared their intention to put an end to this problem once and for all, to denazify the Ukrainian, to denazify Ukraine and demilitarize Ukraine. And again, going back to the Azov Battalion, a wing of the National Guard, which is a Nazi organization, the Azov Battalion, no question about it. Just look at their symbol with the SS and Nazi symbolism. And all these other groups, Right Sector, there's some other groups that are ultra-nationalist neo-Nazi groups. And people try to say, oh, Zelensky is Jewish. How can there be Nazis in Ukraine? Well, Zelensky, actually, when he was first elected, he a little background on Zelensky. He's from the Donbass. He's a Russian speaker, actually. And when he started out, he acknowledged very openly that there's a huge Nazi problem in Ukraine. And he ran as someone who was a reformer, who was a peace candidate to try and make peace with the Donbass and improve relations with Russia. He's running against Poroshenko, who was at the time to the right of Zelensky. And so Zelensky was seen as a peace candidate, a reformer, someone who'd be less hostile towards the Donbass. And the thing is, he learned very quickly that he had no power. He was told in no uncertain terms by these Right Sector gangs and the Azov Battalion military that if Zelensky did anything to try and make peace with the Donbass, they would kill him. And they were serious about it. And they actually have power. They actually have power in the police forces, the intelligence, and the military, these far-right organizations. People try to say, oh, it's small groups, all this stuff. Well, it's not a question of how big they are. It's about how much power they have. And if you want to tell me that they don't have power, back in December, you had Zelensky in the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, awarding a Right Sector neo-Nazi a national award decoration. You have this they say this Jewish president, right, giving an award to this Nazi far-right, this far-right guy from the Right Sector. Why is that? Well, that's because they're the ones with the power, and Zelensky knows he needs to do things like this because they're the ones with the power, and that if he did anything to try and improve relations with Russia or to make peace with the Donbass, the Nazis would kill him. So they're the ones with actual power, and it's also reflected in the fact that the Nazi collaborator, ethnic cleanser, Stepan Bandera is seen as a hero throughout the country by the government. There's statues of him. There's streets named after him, while at the same time, the Ukrainian government tears down monuments, the Soviet victory over fascism in World War II, the Soviets who liberated Ukraine from the Nazis. So as this government is tearing down the statues of the people who crushed the Nazis in World War II and liberated Ukraine from the Nazis, they're building statues to the collaborator, Stepan Bandera. So if you want to tell me that because he's Jewish, none of this stuff matters, that's complete nonsense. The Nazis are the ones with the actual power. Zelensky has no power in the country. And if he did have power, he would not be, they say he's Jewish. Well, he would not be celebrating these people who did ethnic cleansing of Jews and collaborated with the Nazis. It's that simple. So Russia, as far as what, Russia's special operation, they, there's some very good analysis of it from actual former military, U.S. military people. Scott Ritter, I would highly recommend people check out Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, former U.S. military. He has a lot of good stuff to say about this. And there's some others, but the whole point of this is not to occupy Ukraine. The whole point of this is not to, they're not interested in that. The point is to get rid of the Nazis, denazify Ukraine, and demilitarize the country. And there's been so many lies told that Russia is not doing effectively and all of this. I have some videos on this on my channel, Family Liberation channel. You could check out where I go into detail on it. Russia is doing extremely effectively, and that's just the fact. And they've used very little forces compared to what they have available, because the Russian people do not see Ukraine, even though it has this huge Nazi problem and all the NATO problem and everything. They do not see Ukraine as, like, say, Nazi Germany in World War II. They see the Ukrainian people as their brothers. And in many cases, they are their brothers. They are their cousins. They are their family members. There's so much families across the border in Russia and in Ukraine. There's so much, because these countries, not only was it part of the Soviet Union, but Russia and Ukraine's history and culture are deeply intertwined. They are the same people. And you have families that are in both countries, Ukraine and Russia. So they see the people as their brothers, and indeed they are their brothers in many cases. And so they're not going in there to flatten Ukraine. They are extremely cautious. And if you look at their tactics, they're not using heavy artillery and their most sophisticated stuff against cities. They're going in very light to their own detriment. In fact, Russia is unnecessarily taking casualties with its infantry because they want to avoid, breaking out the heavy artillery in cities and stuff. And look at Kiev. They had the full ability to, look at what the United States did in Yugoslavia. 80 days of heavy bombardment. Look at what the U.S. did in Baghdad with shock and awe and all this stuff, bombing Iraq and bombing Syria. You can look at Raqqa, what the U.S. did there, flattening these cities. Russia did not do anything like that. And that's because Russia does not want to do that because they see these people as their own people. And also from a strategic standpoint, if you do that, what's the point? You're going to just have everyone against you. You're going to turn more people against you than you should. It's completely against their interests. So they're not doing that. They're going in very light. And despite that, all these people want to say Russia's not doing effectively. It's complete nonsense. They've practically liberated all of the Donbass. They have linked up the territory of Crimea to the Donbass, which is extremely important. They have a land connection to there. They have eradicated the Nazi hive in Mariupol. The city of Mariupol was the stronghold, the biggest stronghold of the Nazi Azov battalion. They have liberated it, and it was extremely difficult. It was extremely difficult fighting because what the Nazis did, just like the Nazis in World War II, the Ukrainian Nazis, just like the German Nazis, what they'd do is they'd use civilians as human shields, and that's what they were doing in Mariupol. Russia was trying to set up humanitarian corridors to get civilians out, and these Nazis would shoot at them and kill them rather than let them escape. And so it was a difficult fight, but they liberated Mariupol and very cautiously, trying painstakingly to avoid as best they could civilian casualties. And with the media, the media tries to say, oh, look, they bombed this school, they bombed this hospital, blah, blah, blah. Russia has no interest in going out of its way to bomb civilian infrastructure. That's just completely idiotic. Do you think that they want to destroy this infrastructure when they're the ones who, if these people claim Russia wants to occupy Ukraine, did they just want rubble there? No, they need these things for the aftermath so people can live comfortably and have, a stable society afterwards. That way they can look to Russia positively. If they just destroy everything, everyone's going to hate Russia. So they have no interest in doing that. The only time Russia would say attack a building like this is because, and we've seen videos, the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian Nazis have posted videos of this where they take snipers, rockets, rocket launchers, RPGs and such, machine guns, and they put them in these buildings, hospitals, schools and such, and they use these peaceful civilian buildings like hospitals and such. These Nazis, the Ukrainian military, the Azov battalion, they use it as a base. And so if you're being fired upon from one of these buildings, you're going to hit back, right? I mean, that's just simple. If you're getting rockets fired at you from a building, it no longer matters what that building is. You're going to take them out there. So that's what's been going on. The Ukrainian military and the Azov battalion, in desperation, they've been using civilians as human shields. They've been using civilian buildings and stuff, hiding their artillery and such nearby, like apartment complexes and such, to try and use civilians as human shields. And so Russia's been very cautious of that, and they're absolutely winning. There's no question about that. The only thing that these fools can point to is like the situation in Kiev. Well, Russia had no interest in going into Kiev. If you look at the number of forces that they had, the population in Kiev versus the number of forces they had assembled around Kiev, it was never in the cards for Russia to go in and occupy Kiev. They would never be able to control it with that number of forces. That was never the intention. The intention there was, on one hand, to tie down the Ukrainian military there while the real heavy fighting goes on around the coast and in Donbass. And Russia has control of pretty much most of the coast at this point, linked up to Donbass to Crimea. And that operation around Kiev, it was to basically tie down the Ukrainian government and basically distract them, keep them off balance. And the intention was never to go all in Kiev, because if you look at the forces, any military, you look at military strategy and stuff, with the number of forces that they had there, they had no possibility of occupying the city of Kiev with that number of forces. So Russia is doing very well, and they're being very cautious to avoid civilian casualties, totally different from what the U.S. does in Iraq and Syria and Yugoslavia and such. And the reason why the media lies to say that Russia is not doing well and Russia is somehow losing, it's pretty hilarious that they would say that when you look at the actual situation on the ground. They say this because they want to portray it as if the Ukrainian military is fighting gallantly and effectively. And look, this little Ukraine is standing up to this big Russia. And the purpose for that is a psychological operation to get Americans and other Western populations to think, well, these people, they're fighting so bravely. That must mean they don't want Russia. We have to at least do something. They're putting their lives on the line to defend themselves. We should give them as much weapons as we can. They're fighting bravely. It's a psychological operation to manufacture consent for further flooding of the country with U.S. and NATO weaponry to make them seem like they're fighting effectively and everything to justify this further weaponizing, throwing more fuel on the fire. And on the other hand, it's also to give a false impression of the situation to make you think Russia is supposedly losing. Again, that's a laughable idea. Part of the reason for that is because they're talking about, you see this, U.S. politicians and U.S. media talking about Russia supposedly doing a chemical attack in Syria. It's complete nonsense. Russia would have no interest whatsoever in doing a chemical attack. But the reason they say that is because they want to paint this picture that Russia's doing badly, and so they're desperate. And then when the Western media tries to say, oh, look, Russia did a chemical attack, there'll be the reason for it back in people's minds, because there's already this propaganda built up, people thinking, oh, Russia's not doing well. So it's maybe a little bit realistic that Russia may do a chemical attack, but it's complete nonsense. Russia's doing very effectively. They wouldn't do something like that. And it's very similar to Syria. We saw in 2017 and 2018, when the Syrian government was winning very effectively against the Western-backed terrorists, the United States claimed that there was a chemical attack. Again, complete nonsense, completely against the interests of the Syrian government to do that. They're winning. A chemical attack would be something which would bring world condemnation and world interference against the Syrian government. It's propaganda to try and, they paint this picture like Russia's not doing well to maybe make people think that Russia would have reason to do that. When they have no reason to do that, they wouldn't do that. And so this is a huge this is a huge psychological operation going on. I kind of went really far into this, but that's the situation in Ukraine. And you could go back just real quick, going back further, a little bit further. I started 2013, 2014, but it goes back earlier than that. I talked a little about the Nazi collaborators, Stepan Bandera and stuff, and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. I would highly recommend people check out Oliver Stone's documentaries on Ukraine, Ukraine on Fire, and then there's an update to that. Do you guys know the name of the second? There's like a part 2 to that. I don't know if you guys know.
I think there's 3. I think it's a trilogy.
There's multiple parts, but that does a great job going into the history. And something from that I just want to mention is that the United States, at the end of World War II, the United States, the CIA, took all of these Ukrainian Nazi collaborators that worked for the Nazis. These Ukrainian Nazis, they ran westward, and the United States took them, didn't put them on trial, didn't hang them, didn't do anything to them, didn't hand them back to the Soviets. They took them and used them as useful tools against the Soviets. They recycled the Nazi collaborators for the purpose of the Cold War anti-communism. And so the United States has long been cultivating the Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Since the end of World War II, they've been doing this with a plan to destabilize Ukraine and use Ukraine to target Russia. And this is all very well documented, goes back far. And that was really in depth, but just to put it in a nutshell, condense it, really shortly, the United States right now is trying to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian.
Thank you, brother. I know there was some frustration in the chat, like, oh, we heard this. And I just got to tell people, Go back and rewatch what Nick just said. Take notes and tell every single person that you see what they just said, because the enemy is out there, trying to psychologically manipulate them against their own interests. As we see inflation and gas prices get higher, and in Europe, I mean, I recently did I'm kind of angry, because I'm a working class Marxist Leninist, American, and I'm constantly told that, oh, stupid Americans, they can't get a good social democracy like we got in Europe over here. This so-called social democracies are so loyal to the monopoly capitalists and the imperialists here that they're about to shut off gas and freeze their own people and destroy their own economies because they're so loyal imperialist. These are the better life, and this is what I should be supporting, these social democracies in Europe. And it's absolutely disgusting. They're simply junior partners to the monopoly capitalists. The monopoly is here that make our lives a living hell. And there's far more to be energized and inspired by China, by Vietnam, by Venezuela, by the third world, and by the oppressed nations that aren't getting social programs hooked to the imperialist system that's also holding us down, but building from scratch and making alliances and engaging and win-win trade. Now, I think everybody go back and watch that again. Take notes. I want to get Jay's word on this. Anything to add? Anything on the bigger situation? I know you do a lot of good work about Yemen and Syria. Maybe if you want to talk a little further, brother.
Sure. I think that this is the time for working class people in Western countries to point out that US dollar hegemony in particular, especially if you live in the United States. And like, to be perfectly honest, as like someone who lives in Australia, our president may as well be Joe Biden. I mean, we're not really an independent country. Whatever the United States says, our government just follows. So Australia has been like sending lethal aid to support Ukraine against Russia. But this is the time when we have to say that we should no longer be wasting money on wars. We should actually be expropriating the wealthy within our own countries, especially within the United States, and reindustrializing. That should be the focus. There should be an inward focus, so stop focusing on the rest of the world. The rest of the world will do its own thing, because ultimately the reason why all of these economic sanctions are backfiring on the United States, the reason why the Russian ruble has recovered to the level it was before the war, is because the world doesn't need the US dollar. And if this process intensifies, and if the US cannot back its currency with industrial supplies of goods, then the inflation is just going to get worse and worse. So, what I suggest, and this will be my final thought, is that populists, leftists, Marxist, Leninist, socialists, patriotic socialists, if you will, in the United States, across the West, should be making this argument, which is that they should basically be putting forward the following deal to Russia, China, and the other major industrial rivals to the United States, which is to say, you destroy a large number of your US dollars, and in exchange, the US will extricate itself, will withdraw itself militarily from large parts of the world. I mean, if you look at a map of the world, US bases are everywhere. They're completely encircling Russia. They're all over the Middle East. They're in the Gulf. They're in the Pacific. Everywhere you find US bases, right? I think that would be a really good quid pro quo, because the problem is that if countries around the world start selling off their US dollars, so if, like Russia, for example, starts selling its US dollars and buying gold instead, which they're already doing, then you're going to have a gigantic wave, a gigantic flood of US dollars entering the global economy, and that is going to cause hyperinflation. You're going to have Zimbabwe levels of hyperinflation in the United States unless you're able to back those dollars with actual production. And that's something that would benefit the American working class, because a lot of the industries that have gone overseas will come back. A lot of basic manufacturing, so just the production of like t-shirts, shoes, clothing, right? Like, why can't all of that return to the United States? Because what you have in the United States right now is an extremely disproportionate economy where the US does have some very important technological monopolies, So, for example, semiconductor manufacturing, a lot of that is US technology. But in terms of everything else, the US relies on printing its imports by simply importing from the rest of the world. The supply depot of humanity is China. And it's been like that for a while. So why not diversify? Like, this is what I say in Australia all the time, is that we have the opposite attitude towards China that we should be having. We have free trade with China plus hostility with China, when really we need something the opposite, which is we need protectionism with China so that we can rebuild our industries. And a lot of working class people in Australia would be in favor of that, because there's no way that our industries can compete with China because they're just so much better at organizing their economy than we are. But otherwise, we need friendly relations with China. So protectionism and friendly relations rather than free trade and hostility, which makes absolutely no sense, because if there were to be a hot war between Australia and China, what's going to happen? China could very easily block shipments to Australia of oil, and then we'd have hyperinflation as well. The reason the hyperinflation hasn't hit Australia as bad as it's hit the United States is because our shipping routes are much shorter. Much shorter distances to go from China to Australia than it is to go from China all the way to the United States. And on top of that, Australia has an abundance of natural resources, which means that we're actually kind of like Russia in this sense. I mean, Australia's gold exports are actually going to benefit from the fact that Russia has set a floor price for gold and linked it to the ruble in that way, or at least they're moving in that direction. So yeah, I mean, as a resource-rich country, we in Australia do not need to keep the rest of the world poor in order to benefit our own living standards. And that's the last thing I wanted to talk about, is that imperialism fundamentally is about keeping the rest of the world poor. It's the United States saying we will maintain our incomes at the expense of the rest of the world. Now, of course, it's extremely uneven, because most of that income growth goes to the top 1%. It doesn't really go to the American working class. What good is it to have the world's reserve currency if you're unemployed and you don't have money coming in? I mean, I think 40% of the American population doesn't have, $200 to $300 in the case of an emergency. I mean, that's an actual fact. So, US imperialism, maybe in the past, it did benefit the United States, because keeping the rest of the world poor meant that the rest of the world was dependent on the US dollar. But as the rest of the world develops and industrializes because of countries like China, as this Eurasian alliance emerges, Russia, China, they can do business with each other. It means that the US dollar is not needed to anywhere near the same extent. And so bring back those old working class jobs, bring back the blue collar manufacturing, because that way you don't need to rely on this outdated strategy of trying to keep the rest of the world poor, especially when you're a country like the United States. You've got plenty of land, you've got plenty of resources. Why do you need to continue on this path, which only benefits a handful of bankers?
Very powerful and very well said. We're getting to the end of the program. Comrade Fox, any final thoughts?
Well, it's been a fantastic discussion today, or for us today, your evening. Jay, both you, Nick and Jay, and Jay especially, that was good stuff. Actually outlining something for us we can do here in Australia. Because I know one of the commentaries there, Luke mentioned there about the rising cost of oil. What can we do about it here? Well, we need to actually lay a foundation plan about moving forward, not just come up with slogans and and work with all various interests in this, such as unions, other working class community groups, etc. Because I've seen personally, on one hand, experienced the effects of this whole neoliberal agenda. I've seen factories shut down, equipment put on the back of trucks and trains, sent to port and shipped away, and we've seen the decline of our communities everywhere. In regional Australia especially gets hit hard, even more so, and even in capital cities you see that, and everything and the societal collapse after that. So this is something actually we can actually do, instead of just hearing the usual media China bash, Russia bash, and campaign and everything else. Also, hang on, no, we want to have friendly relations with everybody. Let's focus on what we can do here again to rebuilding our industries. Interesting, that was an interesting video. I forget where it was. It was about the geopolitics of Australia, and you have a look at our
Caspian
most.
Sea,
Yeah, that's the one.
Caspian
And
report. Yeah.
yeah, that's the one. And then they look at Indonesia just on our northern, also bigger population around roughly about 150, 170 million people populating a group of islands with Indonesia. That's where most of our shipping comes through. Now, Indonesia is developing good relations with Russia and China to a certain degree. So for the fear of us, if we're going to, one day, I mean, Indonesia is going to look at us as a hostile nation completely if we're in the way we're continuing on at the moment. And all they need to do won't be China. They just say, right, we'll just shut your shipping lines off. You're not coming through. You're going the long way around. And that could have a devastating result on the Australian economy. Will have a devastating result on working class people. So it's actually really, it's a no-brainer of an idea of needing to rebuild our industry and have peaceful working relations with other countries within our immediate region. We actually are part of that Southeast Asian area geography. We're not part of Europe. We're not part of the States. We should be looking where we are within our own immediate area and have those good quarterly relations and respect for each other. We may not completely agree with each other, but that's fine. But we have that respect. And if any problems can be dealt with through dialogue and diplomacy, not through threatening each other to blow each other up, or we're going to send ships into your area and everything else, which is currently the mantra that's coming from the Australian government at the moment.
Can I just add one more thing?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So, I think part of the reason why I respect Flame of Liberation, Nick Maniaci, and a lot of the work that you've done, Nick, is because by presenting alternative economic systems, so the Arab socialist Ba'ath parties in both Syria and Iraq, and looking at them from a working class point of view, you're actually undermining the myth of Western exceptionalism. And it's this myth that actually prevents working class people in Western countries from ever having the courage to rebel against their own system. Because why would you rebel against your own system if you think you live in the best country in the world? And so part of upholding this myth of Western exceptionalism is to constantly say that China is an Oriental despotism, the Arab world is full of dictators that oppress their own people, Russia, well, they're just the Mongol hordes, basically. This kind of perception of the East and the global South as just being either extremely poor or extremely despotic, authoritarian, totalitarian nightmares is a way of upholding Western exceptionalism. And breaking that down is actually doing Western workers a great service, because then they believe that they do have a reason to rebel against their own ruling classes and their own ruling systems, because they don't live in the best country in the world.
Let's see, Nick. Any quick response or any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's. I think that's absolutely right. And it's so ironic because a lot of these people that attack us, who advocate for patriotic socialism, they'll say like, "Oh, they're third worldists or whatever." But it's ironic because these so-called third worldists, they will say that things like Baathism is not socialist. They'll say Gaddafi isn't socialist. They'll say, all these third world socialist anti-imperialist movements, they're not good. And that we third worldists, who happen to be in the first world, really, you don't really find much third worldists in the third world. These third worldists denounce any form of socialism coming from the third world. So I think that's very ironic. Yeah, and I think it's people like us, the four of us here, we are, we support, patriotic socialism, and we are the staunchest of anti-imperialists. You see some of these people that denounce patriotic socialism and say that it's chauvinist or whatever, and that they support quote unquote revolutionary defeatism. Well, we who support patriotic socialism, we're the strongest supporters of the anti-imperialist forces. We are not ashamed to say that Putin is right in what he's doing in Ukraine. He's absolutely right. We're not ashamed to say that Assad is right in defending his country against a Western-backed regime change operation. We're not ashamed to say that the DPRK, Korea, is right to defend itself from U.S. imperialism. We are the true anti-imperialists, and those people that want to claim that we patriotic socialists are somehow chauvinists or have some loyalty to our imperialism. No, we're way more anti-imperialist than these synthetic leftists and ultra-leftist hacks who want to denounce us.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jay, for coming on. I guess I'm just going to give a few words of conclusion and take us out. Like I said at the beginning of this, we are the reemergence of a mass working class Marxism. And our interests are fundamentally different from those who do this simply as a hobby or do this because they want to be seen as the correct ones or the intellectuals. We are tired of the conditions that are keeping us down. We are tired of going to work 40, 50, 60-hour weeks. We're tired of working 2 or 3 jobs and not getting ahead and going further in the debt. And we need to change, and we need a way out. And the way out is not being offered by the Democrat and Republican Party. And the way out is not being offered by European social democracy. The way out is being shown by alternative economic systems from the oppressed world, from the oppressed nations. And we need to stand in solidarity with them. We need to build power to fight against the monopolies and the same monopolies. This is imperialism. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism. The same monopolies that are holding us down here in the United States and Australia and Europe are the same people are terrorizing the people in Syria. The same people that destroyed the country in Ukraine. The same people that are starving and committing mass genocide to the people in Yemen. And we have to do something and stand up against it and build power. We're going to use anything possible. That's going to be revolutionary nationalism, Chicano nationalist, and the Black Belt South, and also patriotic socialism, where people, working class people, love their country and want to make it better, want to make a better world. So thank you, everybody, can coming on. If everyone could raise their fists and repeat after me: dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
All power to the people.
All power to the
All power
people.
to the people.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.